Good afternoon, everyone. We're so excited to see you. Welcome to Thrive on Thursdays with InnoPsych. I am Charmaine Jackman. I am the founder and CEO of InnoPsych Inc. And I'm so excited to have our guest today, Dr. Billie Jo Kipp. So we will get to meet her in a short few minutes. I'm going to give a little bit of an overview about InnoPsych for those of you who might be new to our audience. Again, I'm Charmaine Jackman. I'm the founder and CEO of InnoPsych Inc., which is an organization that's charged with disrupting racial inequities in mental health. Our goal is to make it easier and faster for people of color to find therapists of color. We know there's a lot of stigma out there, and there's so many barriers to people accessing mental health treatment, and that is our goal. And part of what we really want to do is to change the conversation. And so that's why we have Thrive on Thursdays. We bring guests on, mental professionals and also mental health advocates, really highlight the work that they're doing in the community to promote healing and emotional well-being. So this is some images of the therapists who are on our website. If you are looking for a therapist, that's our website. You can find us at innoPsych.com/find a therapist. We have a really amazing program going on right now. We're working diligently to increase the number of therapists of color into our network. And so if you are a therapist of color and you're not on our network already, please join. Just join directory. And if you know a therapist of color, please invite them to be part of our community. We have an awesome program going on right now. If you refer 3 therapists of color, you get one of our new amazing journals that were designed by InnoPsych. And I just want to also highlight, we are very excited to fully have launched our InnoPsych shop. We have a number of products, including our card deck. We also have the journal we mentioned, and we have a couple t-shirts. So go check out our shop at innoPsych.com/shop. Those are all the advertising I have right now. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we're going to get started into our conversation. So I got connected to Dr. Kipp very recently. We had an amazing conversation, and I've followed some of her work. So Dr. Kipp, again, thank you for being here, being on our Thrive on Thursdays guest today. Really excited to dig into this conversation with you. So
thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
For sure. One of the questions that I ask every guest, this is how we start out, is tell us a little bit about your why. What got you interested in the mental health field? I know many professionals of color, psychologists of color, we have messages from our families, which often prevent us from seeking therapy to begin with, but also seeing it as a career option. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey into this field.
Thank you. That is such a good question, and one that really is one that's filled with a lot of trials and tribulations, as everyone here probably can imagine. I actually started my career years ago, and I'm not going to tell you how many, but it was a lot, because I don't want to date myself, but I was really seeking treatment for drug and alcohol problems, or drug and alcohol addiction, not problems. I was an addict. And so I ended up in a very good treatment program and was very fortunate. I've been sober and clean for over 35 years now. And I really was on the Blackfeet reservation and came to understand that in my recovery, in order to stay in recovery in a community that is marred by poverty and addiction and violence, I really had to do something different. And so I began to research and sought out to become a drug and alcohol counselor. And that's all I wanted. I wanted a 2-year CD degree. But as creator would have it, as I started my journey through education, I got a BS in counseling psych, and then received a very prestigious Ford Foundation fellowship. And that actually helped support me, or did support me, through my entire PhD program in clinical psych. So things were it was like all things possible happened to
Yeah.
bring me to that point. So it wasn't anything planned out or I
Mhm.
saved money.
Mhm.
Doors just started opening, and you know,
Yeah.
and we know that when those doors open, you go through them, and oftentimes it leads you and leads you. And so at the end of my PhD, which I got in clinical psych, and I'm trained as a child psychologist, I was like in shock because being a student of color, being the only minority at the University of Montana in the graduate program, I swore every semester they were going to boot me out because I was there by a farce, right?
Mm-hmm. The
And so
imposter syndrome, huh?
yeah, that was the whole thing, but they didn't. And
Mm-hmm.
I went on to do about 20 plus years of clinical work with several tribal communities, not my own.
Mm-hmm.
And then ended up going back home to the Blackfeet Reservation to become a tribal college president, and then ended up in administration. So you go where you go, things happen for you for a reason. And subsequently, I hadn't lived at home for about 20 years. And in my time at home, my brother passed, my mother passed. And so then it became clear to me why Creator sent me home. So
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that journey. Very personal. So thank you for opening up with that. And, you know, as you talked about your path, right? Sometimes you have a goal or plan. And as you mentioned, the Creator had a different plan that you didn't know about. But you walked through those doors, you didn't question. Maybe sometimes you may have questioned, but you walked through those doors. That's amazing. And so you started out working in different reservations, different tribal communities, but then ended up back home.
yeah, and while I worked I was in the Southwest at the University of New Mexico. I worked at the Children's Psychiatric Hospital and did my internship there, and then ended up in research. And that was so amazing to me because one of my professors at the University of Montana told, and this is his exact words, you know, you'll never do research. You'll probably just go home and be a therapist. Like that was something
Yeah.
less. And here at the University of New Mexico, I met some wonderful mentors of color and indigenous mentors. And I ended up doing some huge pieces of American Indian mental health research that I'm quite proud of. And so I guess, you know, we should be careful how we judge people.
For sure. And I wonder if there's a part of you is like that part of you that there's some fire. You're like, you don't tell me what I'm going to do.
Exactly.
Yeah,
You should have never said that, I guess.
So tell us a little bit about what you do now. What's kind of your day-to-day?
So right now I'm the Associate Director for Research and Evaluation at the Center for Native American Health. And what I do now, what I've brought to and really embedded within the leadership training of Native youth is the Indigenous Framework.
Mm-hmm.
And so everything we do is from an Indigenous model, from an Indigenous framework. We provide a lot of support around historical trauma and the subsequent psychological behaviors of historical trauma. And the youth really, it lights up for them, right? And then we provide them with tools about post-traumatic growth, because most of our youth come to our program with a lot of trauma, as you might imagine, because they're youth of color, they're youth on the reservation or in tribal communities. And so they're impacted, much like I was as a youth, by the violence and addiction that you see around you. So when you help put it in perspective of loss of land, policy of genocide, policy of education, like the boarding school, the youth really are able to distance themselves from that trauma, but to look at it as a contributing factor to the behaviors that occur within themselves, the anxiety, the depression, the lack of self-esteem. And they're really able to have kind of aha moments in that. You know, as therapists, that's what we look for, is the aha fulfillment, the catharsis. And so it really is a revelation, but it's also an opportunity to reevaluate, much like we do in there, and having been a therapist for a number of years, reevaluate on a larger scale in a community kind of setting where they want to go and how that contributes to their current issues or their current communication strategies within across generations. And so that's what I do now. And then everything we do, I evaluate from an Indigenous framework using community-based participatory research, which I was trained in at the University of New Mexico. I was very fortunate. I was in the Masters of Public Health as an associate scientist for a number of years, and I picked up so much from the public health model, especially for community issues. And right now, if I were to describe what I do, it's like I'm a community psychologist. I engage communities in healthy behavior, and that's more reticent with how Indian people are. We're a collective people. We're not an individual people, we're a collective.
Wow, so much I want to unpack with you. Hearing about your work is really fabulous. And I'm also trained as a child psychologist. I'm really fascinated by the work that you're doing. And I'd love if you can share a little bit about your framework. But I think it is so important, as you're probably finding, as you've shared, that when we can locate the behaviors as a response to trauma and connect that back to, like you said, loss of land and all the policies. Same for Black communities, right? If we connect some of the trauma to being enslaved, and some of those policies still very present. We talk about the statues, all those reminders where we sometimes, there's some distance from them. And so we may not understand the significance in the current day, but it still lives with us. So I think it's so important to do that. And that's a lot of focus of the work that I'm doing. How do we kind of name those historical impacts on us that are having these current day responses?
Right. I think that's critical too, especially when you're working with children. As you know, when you work with a child, you don't work with just the child. You have to work with the family, because the child is really almost the boiling point of the family. They kind of carry the family's shame and pain.
Yes.
And so when you bring a family in and you start discussing historical trauma, they become very engaged in revealing their trauma. And sometimes we can see those patterns of parenting or lack of parenting, or those things that have been historical in their family. And then once they identify, I always say, you can't change what you don't know, right? Once they identify the patterns, then they can say, oh, that's where that comes from. That's what that's about. And I think I've received in the Southwest, I have multiple pieces of lovely pottery that I've been given from families that I've worked with. One is a bunch of children around a pot, and the family told me because I brought them together. But those are the things. The things are the work with children.
Yeah.
And family.
Yeah. It's so funny that you talk about the gifts that you've received, right? And one of my guests last week, we talked about that too, or a couple of weeks ago, about gift giving, right? I remember having to write a whole paper in my comprehensive about gift giving and how you can accept gifts, but how rejecting that is in some cultures if you refuse a gift from.
Yeah. And I think that's where our system of education falls short. It doesn't take into account that for Indian families, for families of color, this is very honoring. And to not take the gift is dishonoring. And so you don't want to ever end your relationship with families in that respect. So,
right. Can you share a little bit about the Indigenous framework that you use with the youth that you work with?
So the Indigenous framework really connects them with the resiliency of our people, but it also identifies the trauma of our people. So through the presentations of historical trauma, and then understanding what is the difference between a Native leader and a non-Native leader. And it's quite different. And what we're finding is that our youth really see that your leadership belongs to the people.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes along with our teaching. Like, my education doesn't belong to me, it belongs to the people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not this competitive kind of marker, like I want money, I want wealth. I want to bring back skills and resources to the people. So it's embedded in a collective identity that we have as Native people. And so it's quite different than be competitive, be number one, and it's really embedded in our values of reciprocity, our values of caring, our values of sharing, and our values of honoring our culture and language. And so we look a lot at how does culture and language play into everything we do, or even in a lot of respects, the loss of culture and the loss of language. And so that's how we indigenize our model. It comes from our basic teachings as Indigenous or Native folk.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for that. I know when we talked, probably over a month at this point, it was around the time that there were some graves of in Canada of Native youth who had died in these boarding schools. And as you talk about loss of culture and loss of language, you know, a lot of those boarding schools, that was their primary motive. So talk a little bit about how you were able to, I don't know if you have, but how did you unpack that with the youth? Has that come into your conversations?
It has. It's come in under, of course, the rubric of historical trauma, but it really is a long relationship with the government, the US government, on providing us education. But what the issue was is education wasn't about honoring the student in their culture and language. Education was kill the Indian, save the child. And that's it, basically. And you can find that in the policies of the American government. And so we can say, and we talk about this, we talk about extensively, and have done even prior to this, the effect of boarding schools on loss of language, on loss of parenting, because our people were removed from their homes at the ages of 4 and 5. And they were removed oftentimes without the permission of the families. People would come in the middle of the night. There was just all these abhorrent policies of removing Indian children and then taking them to military bases, because that's where the schools were. They were housed in abandoned military bases and run by military and Catholic and other religion sects. And so with that, we've talked about that already. What we're doing now differently is really kind of spending a little bit more time with that, because it's a huge re-traumatizing thing. And I know you all have looked at, there is research out there that looks at the transfer of memories through genes. And so if I have a transfer of abuse, sexual abuse, harm from a school, I'm going to have a reaction. And so we talk about that in that respect. And I just really want to say that this isn't just about Canada. This is about the United States. We haven't started looking into the schools here in the United States, but I suspect, and others have, that it'll be along the lines of Canada, where right now I think we're at 1,600 children that they've uncovered. Those things have been traumatizing for me, and us as therapists, and me as a leader in the leadership. It's been a hard time for me. And it's been a hard time for me for a couple of reasons. One is, not only do we believe in our ways, but we also are very Catholic. And all these things in Canada have happened in Catholic schools. And so it's really shaken my core value of faith. And that's been something that's been handed down to me through my mother, my grandmother, her mother. But again, it was forced onto them. But it's been a source of strength for my husband and I. And I really had asked to leave, ask him, let's just leave the church. Let's, and he said no. And we're married in the church. And so I have to respect that, but I still struggle today with the Catholic Church. And so we're human too. We're not only therapists,
right,
psychologists, we're human, and these things hurt us too. So I don't know if I answered your question.
Oh yeah, for sure. And thank you again for sharing that and providing that history as well. I can see you're a great storyteller. Thank you for sharing that context. I think that's really important for us to hear, as you mentioned, not just in Canada, but in the US. And I think there's something too, I think there's so many similarities. We think of African enslavement and the genocide of Native and Indigenous people. But that also that one, a lot of these graves were, they weren't marked, right? So you don't even know who, so that means families weren't even able to grieve the loss and to mourn the loss of their children in a way that's authentic as well.
You know, interesting enough, what's coming about now, and it's through social media, of course, is that a lot of our elders are now speaking about the atrocities they've witnessed, about the things they went through. I remember growing up, and my grandfather lived with us until he died, and he was like 94, and he was sitting in his rocking chair, and he was speaking fluent Blackfeet. I never knew he could speak fluent Blackfeet. And mid-sentence, he stops and he goes, "Oh, I'm not supposed to speak like that." So he was journeying on to his childlike state and remembering his language. And I cry when I think about that, because my grandfather could have passed that on to us. But because they were taught to hate their language, hate their culture, hate who they were, they never talked about it or spoke about it.
Yeah. Wow. It's so powerful. We have a question in the chat, so let me pull here. Cyril, why do you feel it's important to involve the cultural values with your psych work, and how do you incorporate it?
Well, you know, I think really you've kind of listened to me and heard the stories.
Yeah.
So the stories are very cultural, and sometimes I'll take readings and incorporate them. For a lot of folks that I work with in tribes, I'll say, who's your spiritual person? Who's your medicine person? What would they do? And I'll even work with medicine people if they allow that. It's up to them. But I always encourage them. What are the cultural resources that you use? What are the ceremonies that will help you? And working with the Pueblos in the Southwest, a lot of their ceremonies and a lot of our ceremonies are intact. And so when I say that, it's very relieving for them to have someone say, your ceremonies matter. Your ceremonies heal. Your ceremonies can help you. This can help you too, talking here, but your ceremonies can help you too. It's not one or the other. It's the combination.
Yeah, that's, so powerful. And I think same with faith as well, particularly in the Black community. That can be a source, right? And I think we get often, how I was trained, right? Multicultural, the one multicultural course that I had, it was, let's learn about the individual groups, right? And all the assumptions about all these groups together. And, then there was never in any other classes, right? And so, to Cyril's question, culture is important to integrate into the work because it's important to the clients, right?
Yes.
And if a client has to feel that they have to leave that at the door, it's not an integrated process, right? They're separate, and you're not really healing the person, you're healing part of them.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that I do that's not so different, but I really include, like if grandma wants to come in, whoever wants to come in can come in and we'll talk. And I just open the door, and I've had grandmothers come in. I've had aunts and uncles come in. And so it's been really, because that's how we are culturally. We're not alone. I
Right.
can't work with your child if I don't work with you. And even when I'm working with adults, it's the same thing. Who else do you want to be here for a session?
Man, you're so, but you know, when I worked with, it's so funny because when I was a teenager and I decided this is what I wanted to do, I was like, I only want to work with kids. I don't want to work with adults. And little did I know, right? But I remember working with adolescents, and you know, I would always say the family's going to come in, you know, at least we start together, we end together. And families would say, yeah, like I really like this because, you know, if I went to a white therapist, I would never know what happened in the session. I would know nothing. And I was like, yeah, like I can't operate like that because they're with you most of the time. So if you're not included in some aspect in the process, that's really hard.
Right. I think, yeah. And I think another thing that's hard is in our teachings, in our education, in our graduate work, we're talked about boundaries. But when we look in working with Native folks and folks of color, the boundaries are quite different. And that doesn't mean that you do the unethical things, but you do also include people that can help support this individual in the community. I've done a lot of work for tribal courts and done a lot of integrating people that need to help support people addicted to meth or different things. So, and as a therapist of color, we can never say, oh, I only want to work with this population because we're too valuable for our communities. And our communities really see us as a resource and value. And so we say, okay, well, I've worked with addictions because I'm an addict and I seem to get a lot of appreciation for that. But I worked with a lot of different clientele because sometimes you're the only game in and what better than a Native therapist or a therapist of color to help communities of color.
Yeah. Oh man, this is such a rich conversation. So yeah, folks, if you're listening, please post your questions in the chat. We have a question here from Kelly. Young people have identity struggles. Can you talk about how you help teens wrestle with their feelings about the Native culture and the media or other exposures to white culture? Does it matter?
It does matter. And that's such a great question because, as you know, and the Black community, but I'm going to speak of the Native community, we've had mascots that are part of teams, the Washington Redskins, the Braves, the Atlanta Braves, and the Tomahawk Chop. And what we found in the research indicates that those mascots have really impacted how our youth see themselves. And so it really does matter what our youth see out there. And so their struggle about being a Tomahawk person or being a Redskin is real. And so I think media really has in the past, and I don't think it's any better, quite frankly, has really took and moved that needle up to where our youth really become lost in their identity. The other issue, and I've suffered this from myself, there's also the media that we're dumb or we're drunk, them drunken Indians, right? How many times have we heard that? There, until a few years ago, there were still signs that existed, and I'm from Montana, no Indians or dogs allowed. And so these are very hurtful things that our youth see. And so when we look at adolescent youth who are in the pinnacle place of identity formation, it really is important to help them challenge that. And at CNAY, we've challenged the mascots and done quite well with Illuminative, but really help them challenge that and really help them not to bring those models or those messages internally to either cultural self-hate or to low self-esteem or low self-awareness. And so really trying to integrate that. And it really does matter.
Yeah.
And one of the things that occurred, I think about in the early 2000 as a clinician, is that I was working with Navajo children, and the Navajo children were beginning to look much like Hispanic gangs,
Mm-hmm.
because that was the thing, huh? They had the hairnets, they wore their pants. And so really helping Navajo mothers and grandmothers understand what was going on with that, and help them have autonomy, but also infuse it with the Navajo culture.
Mm-hmm.
That was critical. So a lot of the Navajos that I seen were into Insane Clown Posse, which is ICP. And just having the grandmas and the family members understand that this was kind of like rock and roll, maybe not, but kind of like it. And then having them really give them cultural ceremonies and cultural supports as well, that it wasn't one or the other. Infuse it with the culture, make sure they have a good choice, because our youth, adolescents, they want to choose, huh? Don't choose
Right.
for me, I'm going to choose. So
Right.
give them healthy choice that's embedded in your culture,
Mhm.
and let them have the other stuff too.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think that as we talk about media, right? So you talk about this very stereotypical images, but it's also the invisibility, right? That there are very few images, positive images of Indigenous people on TV. And, I did a workshop a few years back, and one of the speakers really highlighted that erasure of Native culture is so pervasive in this country.
Right. And you look at the multiple graves that they're finding of Indian children,
Mhm.
and you hear very little about it. Very little about it. And even when we look at what's coming to the United States, and they start looking for children in the boarding schools here, where boarding schools started, we're not going to hear much. And so the erasure of our history is predominant. And we see it because there's, in the school system, they don't want to hear about it. The majority culture doesn't want it taught, but it's the history. And our history is built on the tenets of genocide and annihilation. And it's just history, but we all have a right to understand our history. That's the other thing I tell you is, your history is important. So is your history that has been marred by violence, but also the history of your ancestors. Look what they went through. They went through starvation winter. They went through biomedical warfare, and yet we're still here. What are you going to do differently?
Yeah.
What one thing are you going to do differently today?
Yeah. And, I think, but we see that whole resistance about having the full history, right, with a reaction to critical race theory and all that stuff as well. Excuse me. But that, and it's like also the history didn't start there, right? The history did not start with the genocide and annihilation. There was such a rich history before, and how do we also tap into that as well?
Yes. And so in my historical trauma presentation, I do talk about the trade that we have. I do talk about the family intact that we had. I do talk about how we lived and how we moved, and we were scientists. We knew when to move our camp by the berries and what was coming up, and by the stars. And so we were scientists before science was cool, right?
Yeah.
So they really seem to enjoy understanding the scientific contributions that our ancestors did.
Do you, I've worked in a high school for 17 years, and I'm really curious, like, I would love to be a fly on the wall just to see those aha moments for students as they hear and they kind of challenge the different history that they had about their culture and things like that. So is any of your research public? Do you share, like, how do you share the findings that you have?
I was supposed to publish. I have a couple of major pieces of research, and one is looking at bias in our instruments, like the WACE and the different ones. And so I have a huge piece of research. I've looked at children, Indian children with fetal alcohol syndrome, and how they cognitively take in information. One
Mhm.
of the one things, and it's not published, that I just really have a lot of pride in, is looking at Indian children in immersion school programs.
Mhm.
And this is indigenous language, and seeing their scores increase on verbal scales of IQ, even though we're testing them in English
Mhm.
and they're immersed in native languages.
Mhm.
That's phenomenal. And it's a comparative study. So I have 3 comparison groups of Indian children on the res, Indian children in public school and immersion school, and then Indian children in urban area. And the findings are very significant. I just haven't had time to publish. That's not been my
Yeah,
charge. My charge has been doing the work and getting the
yeah,
work.
yeah. I
And
guess
I guess maybe that's how I'm different than your non-native therapist, is I'm not interested in publishing. I'm interested in promoting the culture
yeah.
and language and the people.
Well, it's interesting. You said I had a similar conversation with another psychologist the other day, and we were talking about like, we have because there's this thing about research and publishing in a very specific way. But you don't have to publish in peer-reviewed journals. Like I'd love to see, right? So, because it would be great for us to be able to see and support that work too. So, don't think
I'll
you have
say,
to go in some peer review. Just write something up. Get a
yeah,
junior to write it up for you.
yeah. I'd love to share it. It's good stuff. I'd love
Yeah.
to share it. I just haven't taken the time to publish. But I want to say is that on the Blackfeet Reservation, we have an immersion school, and a lot of the research was done with Blackfeet children, and they've really gained some funding
Mhm.
for the findings from that. So you're right. I should publish. I maybe in my old years now I can do that.
And you have, and someone says there are a few people who are saying publish, publish.
Yeah, I see that. I see that. I will work on it.
But also, I mean, the students that you're working with, I'm sure that within that group, there's students who are going to be very intrigued by the work that you're doing, and they're going to pick up,
Yeah.
right? So they're going to pick up and carry
Yeah,
it
yeah,
as
because I
well.
present the language and culture research and the effects on children's intelligence and IQ. I
Mhm.
present that. I've done national presentations on that. One of the things that I did publish, and this was when I was at the University of New Mexico, and it wasn't with children, but it was looking at a public health model
Mhm.
that included a native cohort of community health workers and helping empower them using CBPR, community-based participatory research. And I think the only reason I got published is there was an MD who pushed that. So, but it's published, and it talks about the difference in healthcare and health-seeking behaviors, and why oftentimes health provision falls short for native populations.
Right, right. And yeah, so, and no pressure, but this is why I love having these conversations as well, because I get to expose and highlight the work that you're doing. So if there are resources that you have that you think our community might be benefit from, we definitely, get those from you. We can share out with folks in our
I will. Now that we're connected, I definitely will hook you up.
Yeah, great. So as we kind of wind down, and folks, if you have questions, feel free to post in the chat. I saw Jackie just pop in. Good to see you, Jackie. So tell us a little bit about, I think you've talked a little bit about just some of your own personal journey. What are some things that you do to cope? You're doing wonderful work with these youth, but I'm sure there's also, I mean, you're talking about the historical trauma, so we're exposing our, I think when you do that, you're also re-exposing yourself to that trauma as well. What are some things that you do for self-care?
Well, I'm very thankful. My son-in-law came from Standing Rock, and well, I live in Seattle, so I'm, out of the cultural loop. And we had a pipe ceremony at our house, and that just was so healing for him and for us. And so my husband and I smudge and we pray together and we do things like that. But, we're in our sunsetting years, so we just do things together. We raised 5 children. We have 19 grandchildren,
Wow.
7 great-grandchildren. So we're just kind of coasting now. And so we cope by enjoying each other and doing things. And we don't travel much. We just enjoy life.
What's a pipe ceremony?
A pipe ceremony is when you smoke the pipe and you sing and you pray for your people or pain or anything that you need to pray for. And Creator, our belief is through the pipe that our prayers go straight to Creator and they're answered. My husband is a sun dancer, so we have a lot of cultural memory and cultural things that help us feel better. Maybe we don't do it to the full extent anymore, but we still do some of it and enough to make us feel better.
Love it, love it, love it. We have a question. Can we watch?
Oh, no.
What do you want to watch, Sukanya?
Yeah, no, not today.
And Dr. Vorpal also says there is the Mashpee Wampanoag has an immersion program as well in Massachusetts.
You know, that's kind of a hotbed right now for our tribal people because as psychologists, we have lacked the understanding that through our language is our love and our ways of behavior. And when your language has been ripped from you, you lose that. So when our children and our people speak their mother language, their native language, they have a set of behaviors and mannerisms that's quite different. And there's a lot of research on that, is when we speak our primary language. So when we hear our prayers in our language, I don't understand a lot of it, but some of it, but it makes me feel better. And it's just that historical memory, but it's also that love language, the language of emotion.
Great, thank you. I think I'm trying to think what other questions. Is there anything else that you want us to know that maybe I haven't asked so far?
No, I want to end with a prayer from Bird Rattler, who's one of our traditional chiefs. So just let me know when you want me to do that.
And I'll open up any questions from the folks here.
This is Sukanya, and hi. It was very, very humbling to hear your journey. What I wrote is that, is there any way I could be familiar with some of the, ceremonies, because I have a special interest in particularly Native American rituals. I have participated in few healing circles.
Yeah. Well, I'll try and find some basic things. My husband, I've been very fortunate because my husband has his master's in environmental science, but he also has a bachelor's in Native American studies. So he supplied me with a lot of the events that have really shaped the psychology, the indigenous psychology. And so I incorporate that. So I'll look for things for you. I really will.
Thank you. So yeah, if no other questions are on board, I think that's a lot what we talked about. I really thank and appreciate you for being here and for sharing, your stories and your history as well, and the work that you're doing especially.
Well, I want to thank InnoPsych for your work and uplifting the needs of people of color, and that we really need people of color to be working with people of color. And I thank you for that and have skills. So I'm going to end with this prayer. And again, my husband gave this to me. And it's from, remember, our history is an oral history. It's very seldom written down. So this is written down. So we're very fortunate. And this is from Bird Rattler in 1931. And he was one of our traditional chiefs. So that's Bird Rattler. It's all one word. Okay. Enter this lodge, O son, that we may share your strength. Our friends are before us. They have purported great things. They have undertaken difficult tasks. Make plain their trails before them. Bring them health and strength and good fortune. keep their minds and hearts toward all people, as straight as this pipe stem, their deeds and thoughts as fragrant as the incense of this sweet grass. Those are what we pray with. Give their eyes the vision of the eagle to see the needs of the people, their ears the alertness of the deer to hear the cries for help and understanding, and into their hearts the courage of the bear to speed to the relief of distress. Swift as the flight of the arrow, make them strong like the bull buffalo that swerves not from its course, but overcomes all obstacles that stand in its path. As the smoke of our pipe spirals upward, so rise our thoughts in prayer. We invite you, O Sun Spirit, and all friendly spirits, to enter this medicine lodge and smoke with us the medicine pipe. Kamoki, Kamoki, have pity on us, have pity on us. Now, if that isn't psychology, I don't know what is.
I love it, right? It's so empowering messages, connecting back to the it's that integration is right there, yeah.
And from our history, from a very powerful medicine person in our tribe. I thank you so much for having me. Good blessings. May your path be strong and straight and follow like the smoke.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kipp. Take care. And thank you
Bye.
everyone for joining us today. We will be back for one last Thriving Thursdays next week with Ami Putat Jain, who will be sharing her own journey with us. So see you back next week. And as we close out BIPOC Mental Health Awareness Month, always wonderful to have, you know, again, the beautiful, wonderful mental professionals and advocates who join this conversation and love to just uplift your work. So thank you all for being here.